Kia ora. I'm going to step away from the podium if that's okay. Podiums make me a bit nervous. So, from a European perspective, we realize that we need to see the world in a new way. That the old is dying and the new cannot be born, and so somehow we are stuck. And to get unstuck is going to require us that we just look at everything very differently. And I think that everybody in this room has somehow arrived at that same conviction. And so now that we've gathered together, we're going to work on that problem. How do we change the way that we see the world? But what Joe has invited me to come and do, and what I don't want us to miss, is I think a critical first step in that, which is to understand how have we come to see the world as we presently do? How have linear ways of looking at reality become the dominant way that we look at the world? And I think that this is a really important step, because the more aware we are of how sort of present ways of thinking and being have become so dominant, the more concrete and powerful our collective wish to change it becomes. So I want to tell you a story about the history of the linear world in 15 minutes. And I wish that clock would stop. And I want to begin in prehistory, and I couldn't resist a little nod to 2001, A Space Odyssey, because this story begins in our earliest prehistory with our earliest ancestors. What was the shape of our consciousness before reason, before the concept of measurement, before religion, before myth, before even ego? I think that we grasp the answer to that question when we go on a hike, or we swim in the sea, or we visit sacred spaces. Whenever we are alone in nature, but we do not feel alone. It is a spaceless, a timeless oneness. Quick survey, who here has been in a spaceless, timeless moment? And if we have, then I think we've grasped what that earliest awareness of the world must have been. The difference between then and now is that our earliest ancestors, they had no capacity, no tools in their consciousness to break out of that oneness, because everything was part of the same thing. You know, it's very interesting, even in the most modern languages like English, you can see that original oneness at the basic foundation, the beginning of consciousness, which is our language. So I'm going to give you a couple of neat examples. Clam up and clamor, to silence, to make a great noise. Have you ever wondered why is it that we express opposite ideas with the same root syllable, clam? Because this root syllable dates from a time when sound was an undifferentiated aspect of our reality. I'll give you another example. Lie and light. The darkness of truth and the illumination of truth. And at the center of both is this root syllable, li, which was our understanding of thought before we divided it. And some of the biggest ideas in modern language, God and the devil. It's easier if I use the French, Dieu and the devil both come from the same Sanskrit root, deva, because before we divided it into good and evil, it was all spirit. All is a really interesting word. It's one of the oldest root words in the history of Germanic languages like English. All is everything, but all is also nothing. That's all. And these are not mere coincidences. These are glimpses into the earliest foundations of how we awared of the world. And it's not just in modern languages like English. You can see it in any language. So take, for example, Chinese. This is the ancient Chinese character Qing. And when I was studying Chinese, looked up in a modern English, in a modern Chinese dictionary, Qing means green and blue. And to my modern mind, I'm like, what? How can it mean green and blue? Surely it must be one or the other. But the earth, represented by plant life, is green. And the sky, represented by the moon, is blue. Green and blue is the color of nature before we learn to separate earth and sky. So, what happened to this primal oneness? Tana would say that some of us have never lost it. But I lost it. So what happened to it? And long story short is that somewhere along the way we identified a point in the oneness. We discovered ego, the self, a part of the whole that was somehow apart from the whole. And in my civilization, this is one of our very oldest stories, the fall of man. We lost our innocence. Adam ate the apple. And the age of magic was born. When everything was still connected, everything was still related, but now we stood at the center of the oneness, struggling against and trying to master the oneness within which we found ourselves. And we listened to the oneness. We tried to hear it and understand it so that we could be in harmony with it. And the best listeners among us, the elders, the shamans, they heard nature's secrets, and they passed them on to us with spells and totems and taboos to help us to flourish amidst this oneness. Has anybody here ever prayed? Prayer. Have you ever wondered, why is it that we speak about our prayers being heard? Now, I live in a Christian tradition. We say, Lord, hear our prayer. We never say, Lord, see our prayer. Lord, read our prayer. And the reason is that our very understanding conception of prayer, of what we are doing in the world when we pray, dates back to this age of magic, when listening, when the ear was our conduit to the oneness. There was definitely a time on this earth when magic was real. A certain scale and complexity of human civilization where hearing nature and living in harmony with that oneness, when manipulating our emotions and our instincts helped us to thrive. Helped us to thrive. An important side note that would be relevant to the rest of this story is that we also understood that the magic had to be used in moderation. That if you tried to push the magic beyond what we genuinely heard from nature, if we tried to cast spells indiscriminately, then that wasn't magic, that was witchcraft. That was a perversion of the natural order. Okay, so we listened. And as we listened, we gradually began to hear and become aware of certain governing natural rhythms, cycles, seasons, a certain polarity to nature, division of earth and sky, of summer and winter. And that point-like oneness began to extend and curve back on itself and began to take a more circular shape. We began to enclose that timeless, spaceless oneness in an awareness of recurring cycles. And the shape of our consciousness became more like a circle. The oneness became a wholeness. And the source of our power shifted from magical emotion to mythic imagination. From the ability to hear to the ability to speak stories to one another that helped to make these governing cycles meaningful. And this capacity to tell stories proved much, much more powerful than our capacity to work magic. The age of myth saw humanity scale up from hunting-gathering tribes to agricultural nations, bound together not by drumbeats, not by hearing nature, but by shared stories that we told one another about the planting and the harvest, about heaven and hell, about the role of Pharaoh and servants, of God and king. And this was also a time when we began a journey inward, a discovery that beyond magical ego there was a mythic soul, a soul that was as vast and as profound as the world around us. And that was also part of our exploration, part of our journey. And every journey we took began to become also a discovery of the self. Every journey is a discovery of the self. Who hears that? To whom does that make sense? Give me affirmation. Okay. That's the power of shared story. That's the power of myth, and it is absolutely still part of our consciousness. But like that archaic oneness, like that magical unity, our mythic sense of balance, too, isn't as primary, and I'm speaking as European civilization here, as it once was. And this is where the story of European civilization starts to diverge from the rest of the world. See, what happened is about 7th century BC, Greek civilization was in crisis. You had all these many city-states, all governed by independent tyrants, easy pickings for the Persian Empire. Mythic structures began to decline. And it's not hard, actually, to understand why. I mean, we talked about how magic pushed too far, dimmed into mere witchcraft. But the overuse of myth, right? Telling stories not just about the harvest, but about why you might be king over there, but I'm king over here. Right? Or your taxes need to go up to 7% this year because 7 is a number that is pleasing to the gods. Right? The overuse of myth causes us to begin to doubt it. Myth dims to mere superstition. And about that time, there's some people in Athens, Socrates and Plato, as these mythic structures were proliferating and falling all around them. They said, these are just stories. We can step outside of these governing stories entirely and be governed by something completely different. Reason. Whoa. That was a critical moment in European civilization. When conceptuality, when directed thought started to challenge the power of mythic imagination, and wedges of directed thought started to pierce this mythic circle that we lived within. And the shape of our consciousness became much more like a triangle. Our two eyes, the subject, focused upon an object, creating specific knowledge about that object. And the source of our power shifted from our mouths, being able to speak the natural rhythms, to our eyes, being able to see what is real in front of us. Seeing is believing. And the age of the mind began. And there was a giant practical positive benefit to this, which is that the world became much more concrete. It became an object not of stories, but of exploration. And it took immense psychic effort, but within about 2,000 years, the time of the European Renaissance, Copernicus was able to shatter the myth that the earth was the center of these concentric circular rings of creation. And Columbus was able to shatter the myth that the world, the real world, was the same as described in the Bible. And measurable reality started to overtake mythic reality. But the negative was that we started to have a very limited understanding of what reality is. The segment started to take prominence over the circle. And as European civilization burst forth and encountered and challenged and conquered mythic and magical civilizations and demonstrated the power of the mind, the segment became dominant over the circle. The part became dominant over the whole, until nowadays we've reached a point where the part we see has become the whole that we wish it were. See, magic pushed too far, dwindled into witchcraft, and myth pushed too far can dwindle into superstition. But reason, pushed beyond our ability to see what is actually there, becomes rationalization, becomes the clever manufacture of convenient truths. And the rest of the story you know, right? That's sort of the story up to today. But hopefully with a bit of this backstory, what we can understand more profoundly is that the root of the problem that we face, that we're working with, is that we have conceded the status of reality to a very limited understanding, one that is at best 1/3 of the whole that makes up us and reality as a whole. And we have denied the reality of everything that could help us to rediscover a sense of harmony, a sense of balance with ourselves, with each other, with the natural world. So, the organizing impetus for us today is an environmental crisis, but this same root problem is, I think, at the foundation of our political crises, of our public health crises, of the confusion that we encounter in rapid technological change. It is that the scale and complexity of humanity has now reached the point where we have just exhausted the possibilities of piecemeal perception, where our inability to grasp and work in the whole limits us and maybe threatens our very way of life. Right? So every generation has its task, and I think it's clear that our task is nothing less than to achieve a reintegration of human consciousness, what I call a new renaissance. Because the next chapter in this story, the chapter that hasn't yet been written, has got to be about integration. Right? Not surpassing, not negating, not rejecting, but to affirm and combine the achievements of each age in human civilization. Right? The unity that we lived in the age of magic, the balance that we experienced in the age of myth, and the conceptuality and the purposefulness that we perceived in the age of mind. Because it is only as whole people that we will be able to be aware of and to act with the whole. Right? And we think, wow, how is that even possible to achieve a new age in human consciousness? And I think what this conversation today has already begun, and what I've tried to add to our realization, is that it is all still within us. And therefore, the real task isn't to create some new world that no one has ever imagined. It is to make manifest the future that is already within us. And if we can do that, if we can achieve this integration of parts of our consciousness that are all still there, then I think we will be privileged to take part in and bear witness to the birth of a very different and a much more beautiful world. Thank you.